Hello, good evening. Welcome to our Book Passage author discussion with two incredible authors tonight. We are thrilled to be resuming in-store live events at our Corte Madera store, our San Francisco Fair Building store, and as well as doing some larger offsites. However, we also are really excited that we're continuing our virtual events that allow us to feature authors from all over the world, basically, and also allows us to greet a wider audience to view the conversation. Today's discussion is centered around an extremely timely and relevant book that presents a landmark exploration of one of the most consequential and mysterious issues of our time, the rise of chronic illness and autoimmune diseases. A silent epidemic of chronic illnesses affects tens of millions of Americans. These are diseases that are poorly understood, frequently marginalized, and can go undiagnosed and unrecognized altogether. Our renowned writer, Meghan O'Rourke, delivers a revelatory investigation into this elusive category of invisible illnesses that encompasses autoimmune disease, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, and now, unfortunately, long COVID, synthesizing the personal and the universal to help all of us through this new frontier. I'm sure everybody watching has known someone who has suffered from a chronic illness. Myself personally, my mother had suffered from fibromyalgia, and at the time, many years ago, when she was diagnosed, a lot of us thought it was a result of emotional or mental illness. We had a hard time taking it seriously until years later when we realized how catastrophic it can be. I've had friends who suffered from Lyme's disease that went undiagnosed for many years. It's now we have COVID, which is affecting so many people. The long term, we don't even know how far it's going to go. Drawing on her own medical experiences, as well as a decade of interviews with doctors, patients, researchers, and public health experts, Meghan traces a history of Western definitions of illness and reveals how inherited ideas of cause, diagnosis, and treatment have led us to ignore a host of hard to understand medical conditions, ones that resist easy descriptions, simple cures. And as America faces this health crisis of extraordinary proportions, the populations most likely to be neglected by our institutions include, of course, women, the working class, and people of color. The Invisible Kingdom offers hope for the sick, solace and insight for their loved ones, and a radical new understanding of our bodies and our health. Meghan O'Rourke is the author of The Long Goodbye and the poetry collection Sun and Days, Once, and Half Life. She's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as many other awards. She's the editor of the Yale Review. Her writing appears in the Atlantic Monthly, the New Yorker, the New York Times, and many more. And in conversation with Meghan is Anna Quindlen, a well-known, fabulous novelist and journalist whose work has appeared on fiction, nonfiction, and self-help bestseller lists. She's the author of many novels, including Object Lessons, One True Thing, Black and Blue, and Plenty of Cake, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller. Her book, A Short Guide to a Happy Life, has sold more than 1 million copies. While a columnist at the New York Times, she won the Pulitzer Prize and published 2 collections, Living Out Loud and Thinking Out Loud. Her Newsweek columns were collected in Loud and Clear. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to both of you, Anna and Meghan.
Thank you so much. And I am so delighted to be here because I've been talking about this book to people for months, and finally it is here, and all the reviewers agree with me that it is a remarkable book that combines memoir and deep, deep reporting in such an illuminating fashion. It also debuts at #6 on the New York Times bestseller list, which I am so happy about. And so, Meghan, let's start tonight before we actually talk with you reading for a minute or two, and then I'll jump right in.
Thank you so much, Anna. This is such an honor and privilege for me. And I'm so grateful to Book Passage for having us and for all of you for coming. I'm going to read just a few paragraphs to give you a sense of the book and some of the ways it takes up the task of trying to talk about the lived experience of illness, which is so hard to communicate, as well as offering a framework for how we think about disease, why these illnesses are so hard to diagnose and treat, why we resist giving them recognition. So this is just a few paragraphs from chapter 4, impersonation. One of the hardest things about being ill with a poorly understood disease is that most people find what you're going through incomprehensible, if they even believe you are going through it. In your loneliness, your preoccupation with an enduring new reality, you want to be understood in a way that you can't be. Pain is always new to the sufferer, but loses its originality for those around him, the 19th century French writer Alphonse Daudet observes in his book, In the Land of Pain. He had syphilis at the time. Everyone will get used to it, except me. Worrying that your symptoms are psychosomatic or even imagined is part of life for many people with poorly understood illnesses. Although the experience of illness is not just in the head, it is also not just in the body. The person enduring such an illness faces a difficult balancing act. On the one hand, she must advocate for herself, even when doctors are indifferent or ignorant, and not be deterred when she knows something is wrong. On the other, she must also be willing to ask whether an obsessive attention to symptoms is going to lead to better health. The patient has to hold in mind two contradictory modes, in other words, insistence on the reality of the disease and resistance to her own catastrophic fears. I found it hard in the fall and winter of 2012 to strike that balance. I was increasingly worried. After all, a terrible anxiety attends chronic illness. Over time, it becomes difficult to untangle the suffering from symptoms like pain from the suffering inflicted by the anxiety over the possibility of more pain and worse outcomes in the future. This does not mean that the illness is in the mind. Rather, the mind, that machine for making meaning, makes endless meanings of its new state, which may themselves influence the experience. It was in this recursive hall of mirrors, trying to adjust to my body's ailments, that I lived. Thank you.
It's so beautifully done. And yet, in a kind of an odd way, as I was reading it, I almost saw it as a mystery novel. Mm-hmm. You were both the detective, the sleuth, and your body was the scene of the crime. Yeah. And when I would talk to people about the book, inevitably they would say to me, so what happens at the end? Who done it? Right. Essentially. And I'm not going to answer that question tonight because that's a spoiler. I'd rather start at the beginning. Yeah. Can you pinpoint the moment, not so much when you first felt any kind of illness, but the moment when you began to think, this is chronic. I am seriously unwell.
Yeah. It's really hard to pinpoint because the way I got sick was, I'd say in the book, it was like Hemingway talks about going broke gradually and then suddenly, right? So I had this roller coaster of symptoms, and for a long time I doubted my own perceptions, which we can talk about. But I will say there was a moment when I had been feeling fatigue, I had been in pain, et cetera. And I was driving a friend home from Princeton, where we then taught, someone I had known for 15 years, a fellow writer. And there were some other people in the car. I was driving everyone. And I just entered this space where I looked at my friend and I had no idea who he was. And I knew that I knew him, so I wasn't alarmed. But I was alarmed that I could not in any way contextualize him, right? I couldn't figure out how I knew him, how long I'd known him, what his name was, how well I knew him, any of that. And it was just this sort of desperate searching for that context that should be readily available. I was, I think, 36 at the time. And at that moment I was like, okay, all of this stuff, this is some kind of ongoing underlying illness that I need to figure out the answer to. I don't know if I even knew at that point that it would end up being chronic, but I knew at that point that something was really, really wrong.
One of the things that you talk about is the various doctors you see, some dismissive, some allegedly helpful, prescribing medication, that doesn't work and insisting to you that if you just take more of it, perhaps it will work. Can you give us kind of the greatest hits, the most unhelpful responses from various doctors over the years? Because there seem to have been a lot of them.
Yeah. So I started seeing doctors when I was 21 because I had recently graduated from college, and I'm walking down the street to work one day in New York, excited. This is the fall. I'm starting my new life as a young adult, not without its stresses, but I was in a state of excitement and eagerness to build this new life. And I suddenly started to experience these strange electric shocks all over my body, like tiny, it felt like a swarm of bees was stinging me. I had no idea what it was. And it was extreme and very severe, so much so that I had to lean against a parking meter and rub my legs to try to stop them from spasming. And I went to a doctor, and he was like, maybe dry skin. Have you tried some lotion? Right? And I was like, I don't know, I've had dry skin before. This doesn't quite compute, but it was really hard to get further than that. Like, maybe it's dry skin. And that was my first encounter with the challenge of putting into language a subjective experience that's not already well documented, measured, and understood by medicine, and how quickly it becomes something that's very easy for the doctors to slide right over. I then was going to doctors saying, I'm experiencing strange neurological symptoms, fatigue, that's not even the right word. It's something like cellular enervation. And one said, I think it's because you have your period. And another was like, it's New York City, we're all tired. But the overarching response usually was, are you stressed? Are you anxious? Are you, you have a intense job. Probably you just need to sleep a little more and get a little more rest. And, it was definitely always returned to, this is your psychological stress. And you're a little bit, the implication was like, you're a young hypochondriac who's quite fit, and you should stop coming to us and asking for more tests. Yeah.
There's one doctor, I wish I could remember the name, who explains to you why doctors are so bad at this.
Yeah.
Why doctors look at things they can't explain and try to explain them away. Could you paraphrase what that doctor told you?
Yeah, so this was Jack Cochran, I believe, who was once the one of the directors of the Permanente Federation, a big healthcare network. And he basically was like, we are trained to be experts, right? And we believe as doctors in the asymmetrical nature of the doctor-patient relationship. He called it the doctor down to the patient relationship, right? And he said, look, there is a reality to that we have to grapple with, right? Doctors have specialized knowledge they've spent years acquiring, and some of that is very valuable to the patient. He said, but the problem is the patient has knowledge too that those doctors aren't always listening to. And he said the problem, because I said, why are so many patients in this hyper-diagnostic age having trouble getting a diagnosis when they're clearly so sick? And his view was that we don't understand these so-called invisible illnesses well. We can't measure them and we can't treat them. And so doctors don't like to fail. He said, they've always gotten A's. They've always been top of their class. So instead they're like, well, this is your problem. Go to a psychiatrist, because otherwise they have to look at their own inability to help. And that was very persuasive to me, that there's a sort of almost unconscious shield. It's not even malicious. It's just it's too hard. And our system is not set up to help those doctors deal with the challenge. I mean, I'll say quickly, Anna, you said this was like like a mystery. That was my experience of it. And I remember saying to my husband, Jim, this is so strange. Isn't anyone curious to know what this is? Like, can't I get someone just to be engaged by the possibilities here, intellectually aroused by it? And it was very, very hard to do that for a long time. But I had that same sense of, as I was living it, that like, if I were someone else listening, I would want to know more. Why is this person so sick with this mysterious array of symptoms, right? It's like a diagnosis column. Yeah.
Is that why you did the book?
I think I did the book because I was trying to understand what the hell was happening to me. And I had no frameworks for understanding. I didn't really have a diagnosis. So when I started the book, I had been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. And and I was treated for it. But it only alleviated about 10 to 15% of my symptoms. So something else was going on. So I think I wrote the book for two reasons. Because the doctors weren't intellectually curious about this and helping me, I became the detective. I wanted them to be the detective, but I became the detective. And I had to kind of put all that down somewhere, right? And then I think, yeah, I don't know. I like as a writer to write about things that we think we understand well, but that are actually really hard to capture, that there's some complexity or element that I think is sort of going unnoticed or underspoken. Yeah.
Did the reporting give you a sense of control that you were lacking in your body?
1,000%, yes, right. So I was in this body that was, it's like one of those cartoons where like the spring pops out of the machine and then a ball comes out and the whole machine sort of falls apart. That was what it felt like.
You refer to it in the book as the box that was my body.
Yeah,
which is horrifying.
Yeah.
Horrifying to read.
Yeah, no, that's what it was like. And so absolutely. I mean, at the beginning, eventually I was going to become pretty much unable to read deeply, but in this period where I was pretty sick, I still was able to read and to research. And absolutely, that gave me control, especially because I think the thing I personally found hardest, and hearing from readers this past week, I think that a lot of other people find hardest, was that I felt that possibly my suffering was unnecessary. That possibly if I could get someone interested, there might actually be an answer or part of an answer, which turned out to be true. There was part of an answer. And I don't know, I think that the reporting gave me a sense of control, and also that the possibility of change wasn't totally out of my hands, if that makes sense. And very quickly, as I think the book shows, I was learning things that were helping me, right?
Andrew Solomon, in an absolute rave of a review in the New York Times, said that the book is going to be helpful to those suffering as you have. Did that have was that any type of motivation for writing it? Did you think about helping other people? And have you heard from a lot of other people?
Yeah, so I think if the initial note-taking and the initial chapter I wrote about autoimmune disease was almost for me to understand very quickly as I was doing it, I was driven by, there was a day when I walked out of a doctor's office and it just clicked for me. Whatever's happening to me is happening to tens of millions of other Americans. Like, it just was one of those click moments. And I was like, I have to talk about this, right? And so absolutely the sort of passionate, mission of this book is to try to make visible this lived experience that has, like the body in the box, sort of been boxed off and put to the side. And this is really a book for readers more than almost anything. I have The Long Goodbye also, but this book, absolutely, I had those readers in mind. And I should say their loved ones, caregivers, colleagues, because we live as sick people in a social world. We're not off to the side, we're in the middle.
How much of the reaction you got from doctors do you think has to do with the fact that you're a woman? Yeah.
I felt like it was a lot. And I started reading, and the research suggests that I was right? Which is to say, there's like a kind of joke I make in the book, which is a little reference to Jane Austen, whom I love, where I say, paraphrasing the opening of Pride and Prejudice, it's a truth universally acknowledged among the chronically ill that if you're a woman with vague symptoms and you go in search of answers, you're going to be searching for a doctor who believes that anything you say is true, right? And in fact, that's the case. Doctors routinely dismiss women's testimony. There's tons of data. If you go to the ER complaining of pain, Women are treated much more slowly than men are. Women who are in pain are more often given sedatives rather than pain medications compared to men. Men are given pain medication for pain. Women are sedated. You know? And then the other thing that you quickly realize as a patient is that below this kind of level of unconscious bias and distrust of, or, you know, kind of reflexive sense that when women are speaking about bodily distress that you can't easily measure, that it means it's psychological. On top of that is just that we know so much less about the female body. You know, it astonished me to learn that almost all research until recently was done on biologically male animals. I mean, it's just, and literally there's a researcher, Anna, who says, well, we thought the female hormones would like complicate the result. And you're like, well, yeah, that's maybe why you should, right? Research. So there's this knowledge problem, you know, at the heart of all of this. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to talk for a minute about the internet.
Yeah.
The other day I went in to see my doctor, who is quite a good doctor, and I don't have any chronic illnesses, but I had a vague symptom that I told him about, and he said, well, what do you think you have, Anna? I was gobsmacked. My mouth fell open. And then I imagined this man having an endless cycle of patients who have looked on WebMD or MayoClinic.com and figured out what they have.
Yeah.
Is the internet our friend? Is it not? I mean, at one point you find your husband Googling leukemia.
Yeah. 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 No, I mean, he was really worried I had leukemia for a while. Yeah. It's a both and, right? Like the internet is our friend and it is not our friend. And it's really complicated. I'm sort of sympathetic to all parties involved. I can't tell you how many doctors said to me, do not go on the internet, right? Whatever you do, don't go on the internet. And I understood why they were saying that. On the other hand, the internet helped me in that detective story start piecing together clues. And I, in it, found company. There were other people like me. I wasn't losing my mind. Little coping techniques, all of these things that really helped me. But they were also full of misinformation, right? And also there were even the sites that were credible, like, right, you end up worrying, I have leukemia and I have this and I have that, and none of that ends up being true. Something you haven't imagined ends up being the case. So it's a really challenging thing. I think what I can say is that for these invisible illnesses, the internet has been really important as a space for people to gather and start to figure out how to advocate for themselves and for these conditions as a social problem that has to be solved rather than an individual plight that any one of us should be living with alone and atomized in our rooms as we so long have been. Yeah.
So you went online and people told you to give up gluten and people told you to give up dairy and all those things that we've all heard about. I'm a skeptic about a lot of this stuff, and I'm a skeptic about alternative medicine, but it's a measure of how powerful your recitation of your desperation was, that when you got to the chapter about alternative medicine, I was going, yes, Meghan. Lay hands, use the crystals. I mean, how much of that do you think was useful, and how much of that do you think is merely a reflection of the desperation of so many people out there?
Yeah, really hard to know. I mean, in my case, look, I mean, I'm the N of one, but talking to people, there's a lot of research. I did feel that about 50% of it was useful, right? Like the dietary stuff, useful. There was something going on with my immune system. I'm like you, Anna. I mean, I talk about this in the book. I was raised by these baby boomer Irish Americans who were like, the doctor has the knowledge and all this other stuff is kind of frou-frou, and, you know, let's not think too much about our bodies, right? And this was the opposite. It was like, think constantly about my body, make sure every little additive was taken out, and then, you know, peel, you know, soak the almonds, peel the skins. I was doing very elaborate things, and I had really reduced my diet. That said, it helped me figure out that there were just a few foods I could not eat for whatever reason, and they made me feel terrible, and that helped. The other thing that helped was some of the people I saw, an acupuncturist in particular, a nutritionist, and what are called integrative doctors, who are MDs, studied practiced conventional medicine often, and found it lacking for the treatment of these diseases. And so they think, I want to help patients more, and they start learning other modalities, and really working on things like stress, et cetera. That was really helpful to me. Now, were there a few who I feel like just charged me a lot of money for like bags worth of supplements and didn't have too much to offer me? Yeah. And it was very hard to sort through which of this information might be helpful and which is just, a bill on my credit card. And I think that's something that so many of us go through. It's like, there's some knowledge out there, but how do you sort through it? And I don't know, but at the same time, like the acupuncturist asking me how I was and telling me she thought, she could see I was really sick, and just validating that, but saying, I think we can get you better. Like that was care that I needed to sustain me. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know quite how to put this without sounding like I'm blaming the victim, but is any of our attitude about modern medicine on us? I mean, it seems to me that 100 years ago, people thought doctors could ease but not cure.
Yeah.
There were a lot of things that were not curable. If you had a bad heart, if you had cancer, that was that. But in the age of the heart transplant and IVF and all the rest, it sometimes seems as though we believe doctors have the ability to fix anything. I remember going in for some surgery 20 years ago and having to sign a paper that said at the bottom, medicine is not an exact science.
Oh, wow.
And I was shocked by that because I didn't get the impression that any doctor thought that was true. Do we ask too much of modern medicine?
We probably do in a certain way, which is to say we all kind of live lives with the expectation that in certain extreme circumstances we might be saved, right? But I think the problem that the chronically ill are facing, or these people with invisible illnesses, people like me, is really different, which is that there was just a kind of incuriosity, right? No one was trying to do anything. And if they had been actually trying to do things, but saying at the end, look, I just don't know. I believe you. I've given you every test. There's just stuff we don't know yet. I would have loved that. And one doctor did do that, my neurologist, who I just adored. And I think to this day, she probably doesn't know how important it was that she literally said that to me. She's like, I see this. I have no idea what it is. The electric shocks. She's like, other young women are coming to me with this. It's so strange. We're researching it. I can do this, but it's not going to help you. It might help us have more knowledge about you, right? And she was great because, but she was the exception. So I think the problem is actually that maybe the problem is, and I try to get at this at what point, that we're so used to thinking about medicine as crisis intervention, right? And we do have almost unrealistic expectations of that crisis intervention, that we and doctors all have moved away from the kind of hard work that, I don't know, I mean, the patients I talk to are doing a lot of hard work, but doctors have moved away from how do we help people live their lives in this gray area where they're not quite well and maybe not quite fully sick. And then there's the patients who are really sick and their stuff doesn't show up on tests. Why don't we have a way of talking about those people? Yeah.
You said that you heard from probably mostly women, I would assume, who have been in the similar situations to yours. Have you heard from any doctors, especially the ones who treated you?
Yeah, I have actually. One of my doctors, who's a dermatologist I've seen for a long time, who I went to with the electric shocks, and he was like, this is weird and fascinating. I don't know what this is. I could set you up with this research. He's still my doctor. And so he loves reading all this. He's like, yep, We don't know. You've had a lot of problems. Like, he's a very jovial, not defensive person. I think one doctor I heard from had taken my critique of the medical system very personally. And I said, look, I mean, this is really about the system. I'm not blaming individual doctors. What I'm trying to show in the book is that the medical system itself isn't set up to support doctors in offering this care. I think it's doctors and patients who need better, right? It's not like, yeah. But no, there's a few doctors who I'm wondering if they'll recognize themselves, but I don't think they will, because I saw them just a few times. Because another problem, of course, is our fragmented healthcare system. And at the point I was sickest, or when I really got sick, I had changed insurance. So the GP I had seen for a long time, who I really liked, couldn't see me anymore. And I was seeing a totally new doctor and saying, yeah.
Isn't there a medical specialty that would handle just cases like this?
Not really. That's one of the problems. The patient is forced to go to, a plethora of specialists, often in different places, different offices, who don't then communicate with one another. Thank God there are now electronic health records, but when I started going, it was like they would say, I'd say, can I get a copy sent to them? And they'd be like, well, we have to print them and fax them. And I was like, I say this in the book, I get a Bigfoot statue from Amazon overnight. Like, why can't you get a piece of paper that's on your computer emailed to, across town? So no, I mean, I saw 9 different doctors at one point. One of the women I interviewed put it to me very memorably that a problem this causes, this lack of coordination of care, is that no one is trying to solve the whole, right? No one is looking at the pieces and thinking, she's got neurological symptoms, rheumatological symptoms. And so as a result, sometimes when you see a doctor, she said to me, it felt like the doctor was just crossing his organ off the list. Like, nope, not the heart, not my problem. Mm-hmm. And she said, and there at the end was I in my whole body, still sick. My heart had been cleared, my nervous system had been cleared, but I was still sick.
The checklist. My brother was quite chronically ill, and I was with my own doctor and mentioned his symptoms. And she said to me, sounds to me like fibromyalgia. And he went into his doctor and said,
right,
my sister says, which doctors must love to hear.
Yeah.
The doctor swiveled the chart around, and at the very bottom, he had written fibromyalgia, ?
Yeah.
So he got there faster. And by the way, one of the things that stopped him, of course, from going to fibromyalgia is that my brother is male. Although, as he explained to the doctor, he ran Mr. Mom's daycare center. So he was sort of estrogen adjacent.
Yeah. I've heard from a lot of men since the book came out. And I do think there's a lot of men with these invisible illnesses. There are more women with autoimmune diseases, but there's still a lot of men. And they face a sort of adjacent, but relatedly and different problem, which is often they go to doctors a little bit later. They sort of tend not to seek care as early as women do, is one thing we know from research. But they get this other thing, which is kind of like, why are you complaining about pain to me, right? There's a bit of this, you're supposed to just muscle through it if you're a man.
Given how ill you felt, was writing difficult?
Yeah. So
writing's horrible when you feel good.
Writing is, yes. Having written is great, but writing is challenging. When I was the sickest, that I would not, I say this in the book, I would have maybe been able to write a few of the sentences of the book, but I would never have been able to write paragraphs, let alone chapters. So I had written a piece for the New Yorker about autoimmune disease when I had realized I was sick, but I was being treated and I was doing these diets and getting a lot of care. And I'd sort of stabilized over the summer. I always felt better in the summer, mysteriously, still do. And then I went really downhill and I couldn't write for 2 years. And I kept some notes, I kept some journals. I try to always write things down. I'm, sort of a pack rabbit, I'd like to squirrel away little scraps. But I really didn't write anything. I couldn't read, I couldn't think. I mean, I was truly cognitively impaired. And then I got diagnosed with something and treated with something, since we're not saying some of the answers, I won't say, but I got a treatment and I immediately got way better. And that's when I started the book, right? I was still sick. I was still living with what I now knew was a chronic illness. I had given up the illusion that I was going to recover totally, but I could now write the book. So it was hard, but I think it created meaning out of the difficulty. Whereas for me, I don't know, is it that I like control? Is it type A? Is it the desire to communicate? The hardest part was when I couldn't communicate to anyone. So the writing, this took me years to write. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it always felt meaningful. And I think that helped. That's not too hokey, but it's true. Yeah.
Are you still writing poetry, and how is the process different from writing prose?
Yeah.
I know how to write prose. I could never write the kind of poems that you write.
Oh, I am still writing poetry. I'm working on a long poem right now that's a little more narrative, actually. And it takes up some of these questions I've taken up in my work. It takes up questions of grief. My father died while I was writing this book, and my second son was born. Both my children were born. And so it sort of takes up these questions. The process of writing poetry is much more intuitive for me and exploratory, and it's almost like dancing a little. It's like there's something a bit physical about it. It's like I hear something in my head and I want to pursue that sound, and I'm really not thinking of anyone reading it. I'm just trying to get at something. Whereas with both the long nonfiction books I've written, The Long Goodbye, which is about grief, and The Invisible Kingdom, which is about sickness, the reader was with me in the room, just absolutely with me. If I want to go into this science, but how do I not, get into thickets that will just stop somebody? How do I try to characterize who I am on the page so that my own limitations and frame of mind and temperament come through, right? All of that. So the reader was sitting in the chair next to my desk the entire time. So very, very different in that way. And then also just a lot more research. So, months of reading and research, which sometimes I research for poems, but that's not the primary consideration. And research is hard, right? I mean, you have to keep track of it all. And you have to make sure you're quoting it appropriately and citing it. So that was a lot of the labor here.
That's such an interesting description that you just gave, that the reader isn't really in the room when you're writing a poem.
No, I mean, for better and for worse, maybe, but they're just not. It's just, it doesn't enter. Yeah. Yeah.
At the time that you were first seeking help, there was still a lot of skepticism about what was called long Lyme. Now we have long COVID. Is there less skepticism about these diseases as it come and stay and stay and stay?
I think that in some really important corners, yes, there is less skepticism. There are academic researchers and high-level physicians who are at research institutions who are turning to and investigating, hopefully more and more, this model I try to describe in the book of the idea that, has been vividly dramatized to us in the pandemic, which is that sometimes an infection comes and it affects some of us in ways that leave long-lasting damage, probably because the immune system is part of the problem, or the nervous system, or the immune system's response to the infection has left widespread damage in the body. And sometimes the infection itself in some genetically susceptible people leaves like a war landscape, right? Of blood clots in the case of long COVID. We're realizing some people with long COVID have very, very tiny blood clots. So there's, still a lot. It's very hard to talk about this idea of ongoing Lyme disease, people who don't get better after antibiotics. A small percentage of people seem to not get better, or don't get better. The question is why. And I think more and more there's this emerging paradigm of maybe for some of these people, there's immunological problems, and also this idea that infections can persist, that bacteria and viruses can persist in some cases is a little bit more being taken up by researchers. We know that COVID seems to persist in some patients in some pockets of the body. Ebola does as well, for example. So, yeah.
I'm going to go to questions, pivot to people who are listening to you, which is so fascinating. But before I do, I have one last question. It occurred to me when I was rereading the book for tonight that there's something quite political about the book in that you're critical, not so much of individuals, but of systems. And how would you begin to fix, this is a global question, how would you begin to fix the delivery and access to healthcare in America, particularly for people who are not the easy, come to the hospital, get stitched up, get sent home cases?
Right. Well, I mean, I first of all think we absolutely need universal health care of some form or another, that no chronically ill person should be worried that if they lose their job, they're losing their health care. Or there was a point at which like I couldn't go to California because I wouldn't have been able to get health insurance there because I had a pre-existing condition. I mean, there were so many anxieties during this period that I haven't even touched on, where I was terrified of losing my insurance because I was basically freelancing, right? And it was very precarious. So we also need coordinated care. Obviously, these things we've talked about, the silos of medicine, but we first need, I think, almost a cultural shift that will then become a shift in the culture of medicine, which is to say, you talked about, do we expect too much of medicine? And I do think that the cultural shift we need to make is to accept that there are some conditions and illnesses we can't fix. And that's really uncomfortable for everyone, the patient, the doctor, family members. And we love in America to talk about overcoming and muscling through it, or even I think of like Love Story, right? And the sort of beautiful death. But we don't really like to talk about this messy, untidy, intractable, like, and then I went to the doctor, and then it's not a great story. But it is the story of our time, especially with long COVID. So we have to figure out, I think, first how to have that national conversation and to realize that so many of these diseases come from things that our social policies or lack of them create, and changes in the food system, lack of social safety. There's a whole host of things, and I do talk about it in the book. So I think there's a cultural conversation, and I think there's some medical reforms around coordination of care. And I honestly do think in medicine that we need to move from thinking of the body as like a car with lots of local parts, right? And more, the garden model. This is why people go to alternative and integrative medicine too, is you want to feel that someone sees you as the whole that you are. And those modalities and have something to offer us that I think if we could really bring the best of it into medicine would help a lot of people, especially with long COVID. And I will say one last thing. For example, the Mount Sinai Center for Post-COVID Care, which is one of the first post-COVID centers dealing with long COVID, like this is what they're doing. They're making this work. They have cardiologists running tests for these complex nervous system problems. And they also have nutritionists being like, COVID is triggering a lot of food sensitivity. Who knew? But it is. And we're going to really work with you to help you figure out what foods you now can't eat. And so they're taking this much more dimensional approach.
Isn't that a New Yorker piece for you?
I wrote about them in the Atlantic, but I kind of want to follow up there. I was just thinking I've got to reach out to them and see what's going on now, because I want to do a sort of where are we now? P's 2 years later, but yeah.
It's so interesting that they're ahead of the curve on that, because they've really been ahead of the curve on palliative care. I mean, they're the national leader on palliative care, which was another area in which doctors were woefully inadequate.
Right. And actually, I think palliative care is a great model and analog here, right? As you say, we didn't have good palliative care. We had no way of really helping people die or sort of acknowledging they were dying, figuring out how to figure out what they wanted in that period. And I think chronic illness care is due for a kind of reform that's similar, right? Which is to say, okay, what are the goals of the patient and how do we help meet them? And how does medicine's discourse and habits sort of shift a little bit to actually offer something slightly different? Yeah.
One of the questions we have is whether you think that doctors coming out of med school are going to be more open to looking at the whole body and integrated medicine, the new young crop.
Yeah, I think so. I was just talking about this with one of my doctor sources. I think so for a couple of reasons. I think the younger generation just is more open to, sort of wellness in all of its guises. And there's more understanding and more research that, stress and diet really affects our health and immune systems, and not just your heart, but all this other stuff. The other thing that's fascinating and sad is that so many of the people with long COVID are healthcare workers who got it on the front lines and haven't gotten better. And one of my sources was telling me, she has friends who've been trying to make it work valiantly for 2 years and are just going on disability now because they are still so sick and from COVID. And it's just too hard. And those people are trying to really kind of confront their peers with the urgency of this problem. So I think both more open to looking at the whole body, and I think more open to, or have a lived experience of the ways that there can be medical conditions we really don't understand that look at first murky and confusing, but are incredibly serious. Yeah.
Someone also asks, how would you, this is a good question, how would you suggest someone approach communicating with their doctor so that their concerns are more likely to be listened to?
I spent so much time thinking of this, and I have a very cynical answer now, which is, if the doctor doesn't listen, you just go to the next doctor, right? I did find that there were doctors who were just temperamentally more open and doctors who were just temperamentally more closed, right? And some were more conservative and some were more willing to take an open approach. That said, acknowledging their reality, maybe saying, I've read on the internet, I know that's the last thing you want to hear. I really want to hear your thoughts. Here's what I've come up with. But you just have to have the right partner, unfortunately, right?
Female more receptive than male?
In my experience, yes, but I have a couple great, I don't know, it's been really mixed. I've had a number of amazing male doctors, younger. I mean, I would say the younger generation of doctors, most of my doctors now are a lot, I've moved away from having older doctors to mostly young doctors who have pretty open-minded approach and are very up to date on some of the emerging science in these areas. Yeah, for whatever reason. Although one of my best doctors is much older. Yeah.
Has there been any outreach that would suggest that the medical community wants you to talk to them about this? In other words, medical schools, organizations. I mean, I've been struck by the fact that a number of different medical groups have reached out to have me come speak over the years, simply as a civilian, as a patient. And it bespeaks an openness that I think sometimes we don't associate with that profession.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in medicine are open-minded and intellectually curious. And, you asked earlier about like shifts that we need to make. I think one is that there needs to be I'm going to come to your question in a second, but it made me have a thought, which is that one source said to me, I think it's really true, like we almost need to create an area for medicine where it feels more comfortable adopting experimental attitudes toward these areas where there's not evidence, right? Medicine gets very uncomfortable when there's not evidence, for good reason. We like evidence, it tells us what's the best practice. But what I found is that the doctors who were comfortable in this gray area at the edge of knowledge, it was because they just had forged a path that made them so, but they didn't really have support systems, right, that would let them, I don't know. So that's one thing. But yes, I have heard I'm speaking to a number of medical schools, and I've also heard from a bunch of really interesting organizations. There's that are being created to try to solve some of these problems. So I'm looking forward to talking with them and seeing what's there.
Before we wind down a little bit, let me ask I hope this isn't too personal question. You've been out promoting the book. You were on Good Morning America. You talked to Terry Gross.
Yeah.
Promoting a book is exhausting. How's your health?
Yeah. I will say I haven't been sleeping great. And I was like, oh, right. You kind of, you take that much, you put that much energy out and you take that much in and it disrupts everything. Usually I'm a really great sleeper. I love sleeping. It makes me feel good. So yeah, it's okay, but it's a little, I can see a little around the edges that I need to take it easy. I started getting some of my electric shock symptoms today, for example, which I haven't had in a long time.
Wow.
So, yeah. So you can just see, like, if I push it a little too much, stuff sort of creeps in. But fundamentally, I'm, one doctor early on said to me, you're going to have to adjust to a reality in which, your goal is 80%. You're not going to ever be 100% again. It was very hard to hear at the time, but she was very much right. And I would say happily, I'm often at close to 80% now. Yeah.
You wrote a beautiful memoir about the death of your mother called A Long Way Home. Yeah. The Long Way Home.
Yeah.
And one of the things you talked about in that book was how your mother's illness affected her view of the world, the way in which she apprehended life, really. And I wonder how living with chronic illness has affected your outlook on life. I know that sounds a little touchy-feely, but something like this changes you.
Yeah. Profoundly. I mean, it's profoundly affected every aspect of my life. I think it's given me, concretely a sense of my limitations, right? I don't, I think as a person in my 20s and 30s, I thought, right, I'm supposed to stay up late, burn the candle at both ends, work really hard. And I'm now much more like, well, it's okay. I don't have to do everything. It has given me a sense of the lack of control that we all live with and mortality. It has made pleasure that much more pleasurable, joy that much more. Things are funnier to me now, right? Because I want to, it's like sucking every bit of juice out of life. And I would say, interestingly, I'm much less anxious, even though I'm much more aware and thinking about, okay, what are my limits? And partly that's because something really bad happened to me and I've come out of that to a livable place. And so this does sound hokey or touchy-feely, but it's like there is a way in which then what I have, I don't take for granted and I savor it. And I don't know, just the ridiculousness of my children, as in, you're trying to do bedtime and you're like incredibly stressed. And then you're like, I don't know, they were just being goofballs and not doing what I wanted. And I was like, dude, and I was like, what? It doesn't matter, right? So it sort of brought a lightness to my life, if that actually makes sense.
Well, you mentioned your children. I mean, you say 80%. Most of us feel like to take care of little kids, you have to do 150%. I mean, how has that worked?
It is challenging at times because one of my symptoms or problems that I have is a condition in which I'll kind of feel worse by the end of the day. So my energy really ebbs by the end of the day. So there's definitely times when I say to my husband, like, this is you, sorry, I'm going to lie down. And sometimes when the kids have seen me sick, which is really emotional for me, they are aware of the electric shocks. They're aware of these moments when I'm not well and they worry about it. But yeah, the energy, it's funny. I was talking to a friend who's a researcher, she's a real scientist, doing great work on these invisible illnesses. And she has her own experience of an invisible illness. And I said, how are you doing? And she said, well, I have my hacks, right? And that's it. It's like, I have my hacks. I know my limits. And so most people wouldn't know that I'm thinking about these things when they encounter me in my day-to-day life, but I have a lot of kind of constraints that I live within.
Come on, give me your hacks.
Okay, so well, like I have to drink salt water every day. Otherwise I really don't feel very good. Because for whatever reason, I basically go to bed early, right? I try to go to bed very, very early. And I'll tell you more another time.
Which we're not doing tonight. Both of us are up past our bedtime.
Exactly.
So I am going to give you the signal that you can go, except that I do want to say again to everybody on this book is remarkable and it will enrich your life even if you've never had a chronic illness, don't know anyone who has one, to read it, because it is such a beautiful book about facing difficulty and finding the information and the connections to deal with it. It's just, Meghan, as you know, when I read it in galleys, I couldn't admire it more.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anna. I appreciate it. And thank you to Book Passage for having me.
Thank you. Thank you both. Ditto what Anna said. It's an extraordinary book. And we do have signed book plates at Book Passage if you'd like to get a copy or 2 or 3, give them as gifts. We have plenty available. You can order them online at bookpassage.com. You can come into the bookstore and buy it because we are open. You can call and order it however you want to purchase it. We highly recommend that you get this book. It is a must read and one that you'll reference as well. So thanks again so much to both of you. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in and watching. And just want to wish everybody a good evening and everybody stay safe and healthy.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.